welcome to this explainer. Have you ever wondered exactly where we draw the line between a rock-solid, scientifically observed fact and what's actually just a widely accepted historical assumption? Today, we are unpacking one author's very specific intellectual boundaries when it comes to evolutionary theory. We're going to completely dissect the difference between what we can actually see happening in nature right now and what is inferred to have happened in the deep, unobserved past. Really, it all comes down to epistemology, which is honestly just a fancy way of saying how we know what we know.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering observation versus inference, the reality of divergence, the problem of extrapolation, the incomplete historical record, the meaning of revisions, and finally, defining a reasonable boundary. Let's jump right in. Section 1. Observation versus inference, drawing the distinction between seeing and assuming.
So the author draws a really hard boundary right here. They totally accept direct observations, things like genetic mutations, natural selection, and environmental adaptation. That is all empirical science, right? Stuff we can tangibly see. But inference, well, that is exactly where they draw the line. They are highly skeptical of universal common ancestry, the idea that one fundamental kind of creature gradually becomes a completely different kind over immense periods of time. To the author, interpreting genetic similarities as a single, sweeping evolutionary tree is a historical reconstruction. It is not an observed fact. Moving on to Section 2, the reality of divergence, focusing on the acceptance of biological variation. Interestingly enough, the author aligns observable natural phenomena with biblical descriptions to show that, they actually do believe divergence is totally real. Take dog breeds, for example. We know massive variation happens because of environmental pressures and reproductive isolation. And the author connects this right back to the biblical concept of creatures reproducing according to their kinds. This leaves room for a vast amount of variety, even extreme human variation. I mean, think about Esau from the Bible. He was so notoriously hairy, they literally used goat skins to imitate his arms. The main takeaway here, you absolutely don't have to reject biological divergence just because you reject universal common ancestry. Section 3, the problem of extrapolation. This is the leap from micro changes to macro history. You see, the author's concern isn't with everyday micro changes. We see those all the time. The real issue is extrapolation. To put it in the author's own words, observing these things is not the same as directly observing one kind of living creature transform into another fundamentally different kind. Think of it kind of like a computer program. Modifying some existing genetic instructions to give a creature a slight immediate advantage, that's one thing. But writing completely new code to generate brand new body plans, that is a whole different ballgame. So it's one thing to show that a population of finches can diverge over time, right? But it is a completely different thing to establish that reptiles turned into birds, or that incredibly simple life formed the immense diversity we see walking around today. Evolutionary scientists will often point to extinct creatures like Pakicetus, which, fun fact, was actually about the size of a wolf, and identify them as early cetaceans or early whales. But the author emphasizes a major distinction here. Scientists interpret these creatures as relatives within a proposed lineage. But the exact, direct ancestral population, that specific fossil mammal from which modern whales definitively descended, it remains completely unknown and it's extinct. To the author, this means the grand claim is a historical reconstruction, not a directly observed sequence. Section 4. An incomplete historical record, looking at the limits of fossil evidence. To explain this, the author uses this absolutely brilliant metaphor to describe the limits of paleontology. We tend to think of the fossil record as this flawless, high-definition movie playing back the entire history of life. But in reality, it's way more like a book where vastly more pages are missing than intact. Finding a fossil with features that look transitional isn't identical to having definitive proof of an ancestral relationship. A fossil simply proves that a specific organism existed at one point in time. It literally cannot show us its reproductive boundaries, every single ancestral relationship, or the exact genetic chain of events that created it. And the reason for all this missing evidence is entirely natural. Fossilization is just inherently incredibly rare. Most of the time, when organisms die, they decay, or scavengers scatter their bones way before fossilization even has a chance to happen. On top of that, you've got violent geological processes acting over immense periods of time that bury, distort, erode, or just completely destroy whatever evidence did manage to survive. So what actually remains is necessarily selective. Because of this, The author argues that the larger evolutionary story is fundamentally reconstructed from assumptions about what the missing evidence must have contained, rather than what is actually sitting right there in front of us. Section 5. The meaning of revisions. What it means when scientific models constantly change. Scientists frequently point to continual revision as a huge strength of the scientific method, and actually, the author totally agrees that correcting errors is vital. But they argue our confidence really needs to match what is genuinely known. Think about it chronologically. Early evolutionary explanations leaned pretty much entirely on gradual mutation and natural selection. But then, those models had to be heavily supplemented with concepts like genetic drift. Later on, we saw the introduction of horizontal gene transfer, and eventually epigenetic factors and punctuated patterns. So the author asks a pretty penetrating question. When a theory constantly has to invent new mechanisms to accommodate contradictory facts, is the larger framework really as rock-solid and secure as its advocates claim? Finally, Section 6. Defining a reasonable boundary. This is the author's final epistemological stance. So what exactly is the author's final standard for evidence? Well, it's pretty straightforward. They fully accept observed variation, adaptation, and divergence, completely on board. But they reject that massive leap to universal common ancestry without definitive, undeniable proof of transformation. And this isn't some anti-science crusade. It's actually a really strict philosophical demand. The author insists we have to cleanly distinguish between what the evidence directly shows us right now and what people just kind of believe it implies about a deeply unobserved past. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a pivotal question to chew on for yourself. The author has clearly drawn their boundary, demanding empirical evidence over historical reconstruction. But what about you? At what point does a historical reconstruction stop being empirical evidence and start becoming just a widely held assumption? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the fascinating boundaries of observation and inference. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.